January 9, 1945. The night sky over Tokyo is pierced by a distant roar. High above, 4-engine B-29 Superfortresses glide silently, their silver hulls reflecting faint moonlight. Below, the city sleeps, unaware of the shadows gathering overhead. Smoke curls from last week's smaller raids, and the faint glow of fires paints the horizon in orange streaks. In the streets, civilians huddle in families clutch children, listening to the hum of engines growing louder. Soldiers on anti-aircraft posts squint into the darkness, their fingers trembling over levers and dials. Every heartbeat matches the rhythm of approaching wings, every shadow hints at destruction. Inside the factories, machines continue to turn, unaware that their steel and engines are about to be reduced to rubble. The industrial lifeblood of Japan, the workshops, foundries and assembly lines, hangs by a fragile thread. In a few hours, the world above and below will change. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, the cities that power a nation, will feel the first true weight of the B-29's devastating might. The stage is set. The skies have already begun their silent assault. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. Japan, once an unstoppable force across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, was now isolated. Allied forces had reclaimed the Philippines, secured bases across the Mariana Islands, and tightened a ring around the Japanese home islands. Supply lines were fractured, and fuel shortages crippled both the Imperial Navy and the Army Air Force. Japanese cities, factories and transportation networks were under constant pressure, stretched thin by war demands. The Japanese industrial system was concentrated in urban centres: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe and Yokohama, cities that combined civilian life with war production. Steel mills churned tirelessly, aircraft factories assembled planes for an increasingly desperate air defence, and munitions plants filled the arsenals of an empire on the defensive. Yet, labour shortages and resource constraints slowed production. Skilled workers were drafted into the military, leaving apprentices and women to operate complex machinery. The relentless American submarine blockade further strangled imports of raw materials, and electricity rationing disrupted machinery that could not run without steady power. Into this precarious balance came the B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel of the United States Army Air Forces. Designed for high-altitude, long-range bombing, it could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs and reach targets far beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. Its pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate above 30,000 feet, where flak was less effective, and its speed outpaced most Japanese interceptors. But more than its technology, the B-29 brought a new strategic vision: precision strike industrial targets that are Japan's war. The UAAF 20th Force, under the command of General Henry A. Arnold and operational guidance of General Curtis LeMay, prepared meticulously. Bases on the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian and Guam became hubs for a new kind of warfare. From these islands, bombers could reach Tokyo in 8-hour missions, dropping fire and steel on the cities that supplied the front lines. Initial raids in late 1944 and early 1945 had tested the capabilities of these aircraft, but logistical and weather challenges limited their effectiveness. LeMay envisioned something different. A relentless, sustained bombing campaign designed not merely to destroy aircraft factories, but to dismantle Japan's entire industrial network. Japanese air defences were stretched thin. Anti-aircraft guns dotted major cities, and night fighters patrolled the skies. Yet many defences were outdated or inadequately trained, and radar technology lagged behind American advances. Civilians had been mobilised for air raid precautions, building shelters and distributing blackout curtains. But these measures could only delay the inevitable. The industrial heart of Japan, once a symbol of resilience, was now exposed to a force capable of striking anywhere under cover of night. By January 1945, the first waves of B-29s had begun their missions. Their approach was often silent until the distant roar of engines filled the sky, signalling the start of an air assault unlike anything Japan had ever faced. The cities themselves, dense, combustible and densely populated, were now targets not only for strategic destruction, but for psychological impact. A combination of incendiary bombs and high-explosive ordnance meant that firestorms could consume entire districts, crippling production and breaking morale. The stakes were clear. If the B-29 raids succeeded, Japan's ability to continue the war would be shattered. Factories producing aircraft steel and armaments were within reach. Rail lines carrying raw materials could be cut. Power plants could be silenced. For the American command, these missions were not just military actions. They were a methodical assault on the backbone of a nation. For Japanese civilians and workers, it was a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the first missions crept over the horizon, crews of B-29s understood that precision, timing, and coordination would decide the outcome. Every turn, every bomb dropped, every formation held mattered. The industrial heart of Japan, which had sustained decades of expansion and warfare, now faced the unrelenting fire of an air campaign designed to crush it entirely. The first night raids were only the beginning. The coming months would see cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka engulfed in flames. Factories that once hummed with the energy of a nation would fall silent. Civilians would flee, soldiers would scramble, and Japan's ability to wage war would hang by a thread. The stage was set. The skies over Japan were about to carry more than bombers. They carried the weight of an industrial collapse that would reshape the war. By February 1945, the B-29 raids had begun in earnest. Tokyo, a sprawling metropolis of over 6 million people, was the first target for sustained attacks. In the dead of night, formations of superfortresses approached silently, releasing waves of incendiary bombs designed to ignite the dense wooden neighborhoods that surrounded industrial zones. Entire districts went up in flames, firestorms consuming streets, homes, and workshops. Smoke blotted out the stars, and the cries of civilians echoed over the chaos below. In Nagoya and Osaka, similar patterns emerged. Factories that produced aircraft engines, steel components, and munitions were reduced to rubble. Rail lines were cut, power stations destroyed, and warehouses of raw materials burned. The disruption was immediate. Production schedules collapsed, assembly lines halted, and military supplies dwindled. Japanese industrial planners scrambled to relocate operations, but time and space were limited. Civilians and military personnel alike faced an unprecedented threat. Air raid shelters, once adequate against smaller raids, were overwhelmed. Families fled to rural areas when possible, while workers in factories continued under blackouts, their fear tempered by duty. Japanese propaganda urged perseverance, but the reality was stark. The industrial lifeblood of the nation was being methodically severed by a force that could strike anywhere at any hour. The early raids revealed a chilling truth. Japan's war production, once resilient, was now vulnerable to a new kind of warfare. The human, technological, and strategic dimensions of the B-29 bombing campaign were about to unfold in full, reshaping the conflict and setting the stage for multiple perspectives on the devastation. For the civilians of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, the B-29 raids were more than military operations. They were an existential threat. Families huddled in cramped shelters as the hum of engines swelled overhead. Mothers clutched children, whispering reassurances against the roaring backdrop of destruction. Entire neighborhoods vanished in firestorms that spread faster than any escape could allow. In factories, workers pressed on under blackout conditions, the clatter of machinery mingling with distant explosions. Men and women who had once taken pride in their contribution to Japan's industrial output now faced the realization that their labor could be obliterated within hours. The psychological strain was immense. Night after night, sleep became impossible, and fear became a constant companion. The raids were indiscriminate in effect. Survival was often a matter of luck, not skill or preparedness. Yet amidst terror, resilience emerged. Communities improvised evacuation routes. Firefighters battled infernos with whatever equipment remained, and workers attempted to salvage critical machinery. Human courage and adaptability existed alongside devastation, highlighting the duality of life under sustained aerial assault. The B-29 Superfortress represented a leap in wartime aviation technology. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where Japanese interceptors could barely reach. Its range, exceeding 3,000 miles, enabled raids from distant Pacific islands that had previously been thought impossible. Radar navigation systems allowed crews to locate industrial targets even under cloud cover, and the payload capacity of up to 20,000 pounds meant each bomber could deliver destruction on an unprecedented scale. The strategic use of incendiary bombs maximised damage in cities constructed primarily of wood and paper. High-explosive ordnance disrupted infrastructure, while firebombs ignited sprawling blazes that often merged into firestorms. Technological advantage was not merely in the aircraft themselves, but in the orchestration of formations, timing and altitude. Japanese air defences were slow to adapt. Radar stations could detect incoming aircraft, but fighter interceptors were underpowered, and anti-aircraft guns lacked the range and accuracy to challenge the B-29s effectively. This technological imbalance turned industrial hubs into vulnerable targets, illustrating how innovation could redefine warfare entirely strategically. The USAF approach was methodical. Early raids had targeted factories, but General Curtis LeMay realized that dispersing bombs across entire urban industrial areas would cripple production more effectively. Night raids minimized Japanese fighter opposition, while incendiary payloads leveraged city construction to maximize destruction. Routes were planned to exploit weaknesses in air defense coverage, and bombers flew in formations designed to concentrate fire on industrial clusters. Missions were timed to strike multiple cities in succession, preventing the Japanese from reallocating resources effectively. The combination of altitude, formation discipline, and sustained pressure disrupted not only production schedules, but also civilian morale. Rail lines were severed, power stations destroyed, and emergency services overwhelmed. In essence, the raids became a systematic dismantling of Japan's war infrastructure. Tactical innovation lay not only in target selection, but in understanding the interplay of industrial layout, urban density, and defensive capability. Each mission taught planners more about how to maximize effect, and each raid brought Japan closer to an industrial collapse that would resonate far beyond the battlefield. At the heart of the B-29 campaign was General Curtis LeMay, whose vision reshaped strategic bombing in the Pacific. LeMay understood that Japan's industrial strength was concentrated in its urban centers, and that targeting these hubs would yield maximum impact. Unlike previous commanders, he prioritized incendiary raids over precision bombing at high altitudes, recognizing that city construction made fire the most efficient weapon. LeMay coordinated meticulously. Bomber streams were timed to hit multiple cities in succession, formations optimized for firestorm effects, and crews drilled relentlessly for mission accuracy. On the Japanese side, leadership faced impossible choices. Industrial ministers and military commanders struggled to maintain production under constant threat. Requests to disperse factories were limited by geography and logistics. Evacuations were chaotic, and the lack of advanced air defense technology made their efforts largely reactive. Japanese leadership understood the stakes. Each raid eroded both industrial output and civilian morale, yet political ideology and pride prevented concessions or large-scale surrender. The decisions on both sides reflected the intersection of strategy, technology, and human consequence, demonstrating how leadership could amplify or mitigate the destructive power of war. Japanese military forces confronted a foe they were ill-equipped to challenge. Anti-aircraft batteries, often outdated, offered limited resistance against high-altitude B-29s. Night fighter squadrons, primarily using Nakajima Ki-44s and Mitsubishi Ki-46, struggled with range, speed, and radar guidance. Cities were lightly defended, leaving industrial cores exposed. Rail lines, critical for transporting raw materials and finished goods, were vulnerable to aerial disruption. Civilians often became de facto air raid responders, aiding firefighters and directing traffic, blurring the lines between home front and battlefield. Attempts to bolster defences included repositioning anti-aircraft guns, deploying searchlights, and conducting limited interceptor patrols. Yet the sheer scale, speed, and altitude of B-29 formations rendered these measures largely ineffective. Each raid forced a recalibration of defensive strategy, but the technological and logistical imbalance left Japanese forces on the back foot. Their role became one of survival, improvisation, and delay rather than decisive action, a reflection of both the scale of American air power and the vulnerability of a nation stretched thin by prolonged war. The B-29 campaign raised profound ethical and strategic questions. Civilians, once peripheral to military planning, became unavoidable targets due to the urban industrial nature of Japanese production. Firebombing destroyed homes, hospitals, schools, and factories simultaneously, creating staggering human casualties. Yet from a strategic perspective, the raids accelerated Japan's defeat, potentially shortening the war and preventing further Allied and Japanese military deaths. American planners weighed destruction against expediency. A fully operational industrial network would prolong resistance, increase battlefield casualties, and demand greater amphibious invasions. The moral dilemma was stark. Maximizing efficiency in war often meant civilian suffering. Historians have debated whether these measures were necessary or excessive, but in the moment, military necessity guided every decision. The raids exemplified a modern form of total war, where technology, strategy and morality collided over the rooftops of cities destined to burn. The combination of human endurance, technological innovation, tactical planning, leadership decisions, enemy resistance, and moral complexity sets the stage for the climax of the campaign. From the first incendiary waves to the devastating firestorms that engulfed Tokyo and Nagoya, every angle converged in a turning point that would irreversibly weaken Japan's industrial and military capacity. March 9, 1945. The night sky above Tokyo darkened with the silhouettes of more than 300 B-29 Superfortresses. Each bomber carried a payload of incendiary bombs meticulously designed to ignite the dense wooden neighborhoods surrounding industrial centers. The city, already exhausted from months of smaller raids, trembled as the first bombs fell. Streets disappeared in walls of flame, rooftops collapsed into infernos, and the cries of civilians rose above the roar of engines. Within hours, a firestorm consumed nearly 16 square miles, claiming tens of thousands of lives and leaving a city in smouldering ruin. The raid, later named Operation Meeting House, became the single most destructive bombing in human history. Tokyo's industrial capacity, transportation networks, and civilian infrastructure were obliterated in a single night. Simultaneously, raids on Nagoya and Osaka targeted factories producing aircraft engines, steel, and munitions critical to Japan's war effort. Each B-29 formation moved with precise timing, guided by radar and experienced crews who had rehearsed for months. Cities became chessboards. Every railroad line, power plant, and factory was a strategic node to be destroyed. In Osaka, incendiaries ignited massive industrial districts, halting production lines and severing connections between factories and ports. The human toll was staggering, yet it was only a fraction of the overall objective: to dismantle the industrial lifeblood of Japan. LeMay's strategy emphasized sustained pressure. Following Tokyo, B-29 struck Kobe, Yokohama, and the surrounding manufacturing hubs. Each mission refined bombing techniques, improved formation coordination, and expanded the area of destruction. Japanese fire brigades and civil defense units fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed. Infrastructure that had once supported millions collapsed, leaving survivors to navigate streets of ash and twisted steel. In the span of weeks, the nation's industrial network, the very mechanism sustaining its war machine, teetered on the brink of collapse. The technological superiority of the B-29s was evident. At altitudes above 30,000 feet, the bombers were nearly untouchable. Japanese interceptors, hampered by outdated radar and insufficient training, could inflict minimal damage. Anti-aircraft artillery proved largely ineffective against formations that spread across miles of sky. Crews, operating under extreme conditions in pressurized cabins, executed complex bombing runs with precision, often at night and under cloud cover. Each bomb, each fire, was a calculated blow to Japan's capacity to resist. For civilians, the raids blurred the line between home and battlefield. Entire neighborhoods vanished, wooden homes, schools and hospitals ignited simultaneously. Refugees fled toward the countryside, but rail lines, roads and rivers, key escape routes, were severed or engulfed in fire. The psychological weight was immense. Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were no longer cities of daily life, but landscapes of destruction where survival became a matter of chance. Families lost everything, while workers who had once operated assembly lines now scrambled to salvage remnants of their livelihoods. The first wave of Operation Meeting House marked a turning point not only for Japan, but for modern warfare. The ability to collapse urban industrial centers from the air demonstrated a new form of total war. By destroying cities that powered military production, the United States accelerated Japan's decline without engaging in costly invasions. Yet the human cost was undeniable. The conflagration claimed lives indiscriminately, leaving an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. Across multiple cities, the rhythm of destruction became relentless. B-29 crews launched consecutive night raids, sometimes hitting more than one target per mission cycle. Factories that had survived previous attacks now succumbed to firestorms. Steel mills stopped producing rails, aircraft assembly lines ground to a halt, ammunition plants fell silent. The industrial collapse was measurable, output numbers dropped dramatically, transportation grids fractured, and critical supplies failed to reach the front lines. Each mission reinforced the strategic objective. Japan could no longer sustain the war. By late March, the combined effect of raids on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe had created a visible pattern of devastation. Firestorms merged with urban rubble, and Japanese authorities faced the impossible task of maintaining production, morale, and civil order. The B-29 campaign had achieved something unprecedented. It demonstrated that strategic bombing could cripple an industrialized nation without a single conventional ground engagement in its cities. The turning point was clear. The industrial backbone of Japan was breaking, and with it the capacity to continue the war at previous levels. The next phase would intensify these effects, expanding destruction to additional urban centers and further crippling Japanese war production. The following months would see the crescendo of firebombing campaigns pushing Japan toward industrial and social collapse. April 1945. The B-29 campaign had escalated into relentless precision and destruction. Tokyo, already scarred from Operation Meeting House, faced follow-up raids targeting remaining industrial nodes. Each sortie was meticulously planned. Aircraft formations approached in waves, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs designed to maximize damage to factories, warehouses, and transportation networks. Entire districts, once hubs of production and civilian life, were engulfed in conflagrations that could be seen from miles away. Night skies glowed orange as smoke and flame consumed homes and streets alike, a terrifying testament to the scale of American strategic air power. Nagoya, a center for aircraft and steel production, suffered repeated assaults. Mitsubishi and other industrial complexes, once humming with activity, were reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal. Steel output plummeted, aircraft engine assembly halted entirely. Workers fled or perished in firestorms, while emergency crews struggled to maintain critical infrastructure. Rail lines that once carried raw materials to factories were severed, ports and docks were damaged or destroyed. Each mission struck not only physical targets but the organizational framework of Japan's industrial machine. In Osaka and Kobe, similar patterns emerged. Firestorms merged across residential and industrial districts, collapsing buildings and igniting stores of fuel, timber, and chemicals. Civilians, many trapped in shelters or attempting to evacuate, faced suffocation, burns, and the chaos of collapsing streets. The psychological effect was devastating. Entire communities lost their homes, livelihoods, and family members in a single night. Survivors described the skies as rivers of fire, where engines roared overhead and bombs fell in unrelenting waves. The technological edge of the B-29s became even more apparent. Radar navigation enabled precision strikes, despite cloud cover or smoke from prior raids. Formation flying ensured overlapping coverage of industrial zones, and incendiary tactics exploited the urban construction of Japanese cities. Anti-aircraft defences were overwhelmed. Interceptors could engage only a fraction of the incoming bombers, and night operations further blunted Japanese response. The strategic combination of technology, altitude, payload, and timing rendered the industrial heart of Japan highly vulnerable. By mid-April, industrial statistics reflected the scale of destruction. Steel output dropped by nearly 60% in key production centres. Aircraft assembly lagged months behind schedule. Ammunition and munitions shipments could not meet the demands of the remaining military forces. Japanese leadership, attempting to relocate factories and maintain production, faced impossible logistical constraints. Factories rebuilt after one raid were often destroyed in the next. Rail lines critical for transporting both raw materials and finished goods were rendered unusable by repeated bombings. The cumulative effect was a near-total paralysis of Japan's industrial capacity. Civilians and workers were caught in an unending cycle of fear and labour. In shelters, they waited through nights of explosions, smoke and heat. In factories, they worked to salvage machinery and materials, often with limited success. Hospitals overflowed with casualties from both the raids and the firestorms that followed. Children were orphaned, parents lost, and entire neighbourhoods were erased from the map. For the first time in modern warfare, civilian survival became intertwined with industrial output. Without factories running, food, fuel, and medical supplies dwindled, amplifying the suffering of those who remained. LeMay's strategy had achieved its objective. Japan's urban industrial network was collapsing under sustained pressure. Each raid compounded the effects of the last, leaving little room for recovery. By May 1945, nearly every major industrial hub had been hit multiple times, with cities reduced to smouldering ruins and supply chains fractured beyond repair. The B-29 campaign demonstrated that strategic bombing, executed with technological superiority and careful planning, could dismantle a nation's war capacity from the air alone. The combination of human suffering, technological precision, tactical innovation, and leadership decisions had reached its peak. Factories were silent, railroads destroyed, and civilian morale shattered. Japan's capacity to sustain war production was effectively gone, leaving military planners scrambling and civilians trapped in a landscape of devastation. The turning point was complete. The industrial collapse of Japan was no longer a threat. It was reality. By June 1945, the cumulative effect of the B-29 raids on Japan was unmistakable. Industrial production had been decimated. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, once the beating heart of Japan's war machine, lay in ruins. Steel mills that had forged rails and ship hulls were gutted by fire. Aircraft factories had ceased assembly, leaving thousands of planes incomplete. Ammunition plants lay in rubble, their stockpiles consumed by flames. According to USAF operational reports, production in key sectors dropped by more than 60% in the first months of sustained bombing, with some facilities never resuming operations before Japan's surrender. Rail networks connecting factories to ports were fractured, further isolating industrial hubs and preventing the movement of raw materials. The logistical lifeline of Japan's war effort was effectively severed. From a strategic perspective, the impact was profound. The United States had achieved a level of industrial disruption that no ground campaign could have matched in the same time frame. The destruction of urban industrial centres meant that Japan's military could no longer replenish aircraft, weapons, or munitions at sufficient rates. Supplies for both the Imperial Navy and Army Air Force dwindled, and replacement parts for tanks, artillery, and aircraft were delayed or unavailable. US intelligence reported the cascading effects. Fighter squadrons grounded due to missing engines, artillery batteries left idle for lack of shells, and mechanized units are mobilized by broken supply chains. Japanese authorities attempted to respond. Factories were relocated to smaller towns or underground facilities, and labor was redirected to salvage operations and repair efforts. Civilian workers were conscripted for reconstruction tasks, even as cities burned around them. However, these efforts were insufficient to counteract the scale and precision of the B-29 campaign. Emergency production sites lacked the capacity, skilled labour and equipment to replace what had been lost. The government faced the grim reality that the nation's industrial capacity was no longer able to sustain prolonged conflict. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was equally severe. Reports from ministers and military planners indicated mounting desperation. Cities were unrecognizable, civilian casualties were high, and the infrastructure that underpinned both military logistics and civilian survival was collapsing. Commanders faced impossible decisions: continue resisting a materially crippled enemy or consider negotiations to prevent further devastation. The B-29 raids had created a new battlefield, one where destruction of urban industrial centres could determine the outcome of a war without direct confrontation on the ground. By mid-1945, the immediate consequences were clear. The industrial collapse was not just a statistic, it had reshaped the Japanese ability to wage war. Every factory destroyed, every rail line severed, every warehouse burned meant a weakening of military operations at the front. For the United States, the strategy had succeeded. Japan was increasingly vulnerable, its capacity to resist the Allies irreversibly diminished. The human cost of the B-29 raids became starkly apparent by mid-1945. In Tokyo alone, estimates suggest that over 100,000 civilians perished during the firebombing of March 9-10, while countless others were wounded or displaced. Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe suffered similarly devastating casualties. Families were uprooted overnight, forced into makeshift shelters in rural areas or crowded evacuation centres. Psychological impact was profound. Survivors described nights filled with flames, smoke, and the constant wail of air raid sirens, leaving lasting trauma that would endure long after the cityscapes were rebuilt. Civilian infrastructure, intertwined with industrial production, had been destroyed. Hospitals, schools, and water treatment facilities lay in ruins, further compounding the suffering. Firefighting brigades and emergency services, already overwhelmed, were rendered largely ineffective as incendiary bombs ignited entire districts simultaneously. Food distribution networks collapsed, leaving displaced populations dependent on dwindling government rations. The result was a civilian population struggling to survive amid both physical destruction and systemic failure. The strategic consequences mirrored the human toll. Japan's military operations were increasingly paralysed. Aircraft squadrons were grounded for lack of engines, artillery units were immobilised by missing ammunition, and mechanised formations could not be deployed due to disrupted rail lines. Factories that might have repaired equipment or produced replacements had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. US intelligence reports highlighted the stark reality: Japan's war production had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-raid capacity, making prolonged resistance logistically untenable. The cumulative effect of the B-29 campaign forced a re-evaluation of Japanese strategy. Leaders realized that continuing conventional resistance would only prolong civilian suffering without significantly altering the military balance. Efforts to disperse remaining industrial facilities and relocate workers were hampered by resource scarcity, labor shortages, and ongoing air raids. Meanwhile, the USAF continued to refine its bombing strategy, ensuring that subsequent missions targeted the remaining industrial lifelines and infrastructure, further compounding Japan's vulnerability. By the summer of 1945, Japan's industrial and social collapse was undeniable. Urban centres lay in ruins, critical infrastructure was crippled, and civilian populations faced shortages of food, shelter, and medical care. The B-29 campaign had achieved its objective. The industrial lifeblood of Japan was severed, military production was drastically reduced, and the nation's ability to continue the war was irreversibly weakened. The stage was set for reflection. The raids had not only reshaped the physical landscape of Japan, but had forced a reckoning with the human, technological, and strategic dimensions of modern warfare. What remained was a nation scarred by fire and the harrowing consequences of total war, a society facing the sobering reality of defeat and reconstruction. The skies over Japan in 1945 carried more than the hum of engines and the weight of bombs. They carried the story of a nation brought to the brink by the precision of modern warfare. The B-29 raids were not mere attacks on buildings or machinery. They were an assault on the very infrastructure that sustained life, industry, and military capability. Cities that had been symbols of progress and human ingenuity became landscapes of fire and ruin, their destruction marking a turning point in both the Pacific War and the history of aerial conflict. Yet beyond the statistics of steel production, aircraft assembly, and munitions output lies a deeper truth: the human cost. Civilians, workers, children, parents endured unimaginable suffering. Entire communities were uprooted, lives extinguished, and generations marked by trauma. The campaign revealed a harsh reality of industrialized warfare, that the machinery of conflict often reaches beyond soldiers and battlefields, touching every corner of civilian life. The courage and resilience displayed by those who survived, who rebuilt, and who continued to labor amid devastation stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity. Strategically, the campaign underscored the power of technology, planning, and leadership in modern war. The B-29, its crews, and the orchestration of incendiary raids demonstrated that air power could cripple a nation's industrial and military backbone without a single traditional ground engagement in its cities.